Precepts incense, samadhi incense, wisdom incense, liberation incense, cloud of lighted incense pouring into the Dharma realms, offering to the highest teachers of the 10 directions. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to all directions of space, all realms, past, present, future, all Buddhas, the honored Dharma, the enlightened Sangha, the permanent three treasures. I respectfully bow to our own teacher, Sakyamuni Buddha, the future born Maitreya Buddha, great wisdom, Manjushri Bodhisattva, great practice, Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, Dharma protector Bodhisattvas, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas assembled at the great holy mountain. I respectfully bow to the great love, great compassion, Amitabha Buddha of the Western Paradise, great compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, great bounty, Siddhikarma Bodhisattva, great power, Mahastamaprana Bodhisattva, Dharma protector Bodhisattvas, all the Bodhisattvas in the great pure ocean. Good morning. Thank you for spending some time with me on this Sunday morning. By the way, I've been asked several times now by a few different people if I would introduce the dogs. And they just left. They came in here when I was getting things started. They like to see what I'm doing once I get started talking. But then they left. So I will introduce them properly next week. Sorry, give me a minute. I'm doing audio recordings of some of these talks again. So I may have mentioned to some of you that I've been planning a podcast for a while. And I've been accumulating content and recording Dharma talks and all that kind of thing. And assembling some other elements, recording the bells at White Sands and that kind of thing. But I didn't have a title until very recently. This week, Sensei Michelle and I were talking, and something came up. She mentioned that we had been thinking about, and she'd had this idea a while back about doing a comic called The Adventures of Sariputta and Mogallana to help teach kids about Buddhism. And we were just kind of talking about things that we might be able to do now that we have some time. And those two had come up while I was giving a Dharma talk about them some time ago. And so we were talking about that, and I said, that would be a great title for a podcast. And so I decided that's what I'm going to call my podcast. I'm going to use a story about Sariputta and Mogallana as kind of an intro into every episode, but and then I'll segue into whatever Dharma talks I've recorded. So let me explain a little bit about Sariputta and Mogallana. Who am I talking about? So if you ever go to a Theravada temple, like a Thai temple or something like that, there's almost always a huge golden Buddha statue at the altar, and then often you'll see statues of two monks kneeling either side of him or standing next to him, something like that. So these monks were the Buddha's chief disciples, Sariputta on his right and Mogallana on his left. And these are very important figures in Buddhism because of their dedication to the holy life and their great compassion. They did a lot early on to help Buddhism spread, and then after the Buddha died. So I see them as kind of spiritual superheroes. They took the teachings that the Buddha gave to the highest level, and they did it in a way that benefited countless others who followed in their footsteps. And so, by the way, I'm using the Pali versions of their names. If you go to White Sands, or if you go to a Zen center and you chant the Heart Sutra, you kind of know who Sariputta is. because the Sanskrit version of the name Shariputra is in the Heart Sutra. That's who the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara is talking to when he gives the teaching on emptiness. So, like every superhero, their story starts out with kind of a moment of transformation. It's a little bit less dramatic than exposure to a radioactive spider or some mysterious object falling from outer space or something like that, but it's still interesting. So there's a festival in Rajgir, which is a real place. It's a hilly region in northern India, not too far from where the Buddha gave his first talk, setting the wheel of Dharma in motion. And it's actually Rajgir is where Vulture's Peak is, which is where the Lotus Sutra was given and that sort of thing. So anyway, these two young men were there, and they were Brahmins. They were born into the priest caste, which is the highest social caste in India. And their families had been associated with one another for several generations. So they knew each other growing up and became good friends growing up. And they were both wealthy and they were well educated. And so by the time they were in their 20s, each of them had hundreds of friends and followers in their retinues. You know, wealthy people have a lot of friends, and people who are kind of part of their what would you call it these days? You know, their posse, right? They have big ones. And so, which is probably dates me. That's probably from the 80s. But anyway, I have digressed. So every year there was this big festival in Rajgir that lasted for several days. And so one year they were attending the festival and they were watching performance of music and acrobatics and things like that. And standing there together, Sariputta and Mogallana simultaneously had the same thought. What is there to see here? Before many decades have passed, these people will have all come to death. And so they decided at that point, suddenly aware, very much like the Buddha was, that their wealth and all their friends and all that kind of stuff wasn't going to save them from the rounds of coming and going. So they decided that rather than spending their time enjoying entertainments, that they really should be looking for a way to live better in a way that didn't keep leading them back to the cycle of birth and death. And it happened that there was a famous ascetic staying nearby named Sanjaya. And so they went to Sanjaya and they asked to become his students, and he accepted it. But they soon realized that his teachings didn't lead to liberation. And so they decided that they would split up. They'd go their separate ways and they'd seek out other teachers and see what they had to say. And then they agreed that if one of them found what they felt was the true Dharma, one that would really lead to liberation, that he'd go and find the other. Well, not too long afterward, Sariputta encountered Saji, who was one of the 5 ascetics who had heard the Buddha's first discourse after his enlightenment. He was one of the 5 ascetics who had been the Buddha's companions during his period of when he was a bodhisattva, when he was practicing the extremes of asceticism out in the forest and so on. And so he was one of the first people to hear the Buddha speak. So Sariputta asked him for a teaching. And by the time he had spoken only a few sentences, Sariputta had reached stream entry, the first stage of enlightenment. Let me just explain that briefly. In classical Buddhism, the way the Buddha taught, there are multiple stages of enlightenment. So the first one is stream entry, and that's where you've accumulated enough merit from past existences, this existence, and so on, that you are inevitably going to become enlightened. It might take several lifetimes, but you're on the way for sure. And then there's once returner, non-returner, and arahant. So you either have to come back and be human one more time, or you can live in a pure land for an existence, or you're completely purified and become free of the cycle of coming and going. So after death, nirvana. So anyway, he attained stream entry just by hearing the guy begin to speak. And so he went to see Mogallana, and he found him. And he must have had a really good memory and been a good speaker, because as he was talking and explained what he had heard, Mogallana also became a stream editor. Mogallana's Sanskrit name, by the way, is virtually unpronounceable. At least I have a lot of difficulty with it, which is part of the reason why I decided to use the Pali forms of the names. So because of their previous good karma and their commitment to living the holy life, they had reached the first stage of the path almost as soon as they heard the Buddha's teaching from someone else. But they wanted to study with the Buddha himself. But first they decided they wanted to share what they had learned with Sanjaya, their original teacher, so that he could experience what they had found. And so they went to where he was staying and invited him to come with them to meet the Buddha. And he refused. He was a famous teacher, and he was enjoying life as a famous teacher. And so he wasn't willing to become a student again. He said, having been a teacher to so many, for me to become a student would be like a water tank becoming a drinking cup. And he said, besides, only a few people are wise, most are foolish. So let the wise go to the Buddha and the foolish come to me, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at that. I could become a great teacher, really enlightened and all of that kind of stuff, but I've got all these people following me, so let the ones who don't really want the real deal come to me. Very strange, but I guess understandable in a way. But anyway, they were disappointed. And so along with 250 followers, they left Sanjaya and went to see the Buddha. And once he met them, he ordained them. And within weeks of actually studying alongside the Buddha, they became arahants, so fully enlightened, fully free of the cycle of coming and going. Well, when they told the Buddha about their original teacher and his decision to stay where he was and teach fools rather than to come with them and become wise, the Buddha said something that's actually coming up in our studies of the Dhammapada on Thursdays pretty soon. He said, mistaking untruth for truth, mistaking truth for untruth. Such persons who hold wrong views can never arrive at the truth. Knowing truth is truth, knowing untruth is untruth. Persons who hold such wise views will arrive at the truth. So the Buddha was commenting on Sanjaya's clinging to status and wealth, and how he was unwilling to let go of material comforts and the sort of ego boosts that come about from being a famous teacher. And with his decision not to follow them to meet the Buddha, he was forsaking a much greater reward that would come from transcending those desires. So anyway, after they ordained, Sariputta and Mogallana remained companions and stayed with the Buddha. They had kind of different personalities from one another that reflect, I think, different but complementary aspects of Buddhism. And so this is kind of the source of a number of these stories. They did get involved in some very interesting things, and they were a major part of the Buddha's life for the period of time that he was giving teachings. So, when Buddhists make this mudra, this gasha, when we bring our hands together in front of our hearts, sometimes, people ask, what does that mean? And one of the things that I think it symbolizes is the coming together of wisdom and compassion. And so there's this side of Buddhism that comes from understanding on a deep individual level some things that, can seem kind of impersonal and academic, like impermanence and the not-self and that kind of thing. And then there's another side that comes from a different kind of understanding, one that's maybe more inclusive, but still very intimate. And so it engages a lot more with faith and compassion. So wisdom, understanding and really penetrating reality, compassion, so understanding the teaching's ability to liberate everyone and the desire that we all be liberated. And those things coming together into one practice. The different people emphasize them in different ways. And to me, Sariputta seems to kind of represent this sort of down-to-earth, pragmatic approach to practice. And Mogallana seems, I think, maybe more driven by faith and compassion, although they were both clearly very wise and clearly very compassionate. But, for example, the Buddha once asked Sariputta if he thought a certain kind of meditation could lead to liberation. And Sariputta said, yes. And he said, but I don't accept it because I have faith in you. It's only because it's only those who have not personally realized it that accept the fact from others. And hearing this, other monks heard this about him not having faith in the Buddha and not accepting something because the Buddha had said it. And so they went to the Buddha and said, isn't that disrespectful? And the Buddha said, no. He said that Sariputta accepted the teaching, that his acceptance was due to his own personal experience and not because the Buddha had said it or somebody else had said it. He said that Sariputta has faith in me, but he also has faith in the consequences of his actions. He put a high value on direct experience of the Dharma, but he also gratefully acknowledged his teachers. So years after he had ordained, he still bowed in whatever direction that he knew Asaji, his first teacher, was staying. And so other monks would misinterpret this, sometimes thinking that he was worshiping the 6 cardinal directions, which is what Brahmin priests would sometimes do. But Sariputta explained that no, he was paying obeisance to his teacher, his original teacher, through whom he had entered the path. So even though his first teacher didn't take him all the way the Buddha had, it had been a doorway toward the truth, and so he still recognized him with gratitude, which is, I think that's a good thing. Even though I'm no longer a Christian, there were ministers that I learned from when I was young that really kind of taught me how to have a relationship with the divine, even though I didn't feel like what they were teaching was really where I wanted to end up. So Sariputta was very interested in developing his own mind, and he became renowned for becoming highly skilled in meditation and for being able to explain the Dharma really clearly to people who were new to Buddhism. But Mogallana had kind of a different gift. He had a natural gift for seeing kind of what lay outside of normal human perception, and so he used that to enhance his own understanding and to benefit others. A good example of that is reflected in one of my favorite stories about them. They were staying in a cave, and it was apparently a full moon, and what happened then and still happens now a lot of times is monks that shave their heads completely would do that on the new moon and the full moon. And so since the full moon night, they had both shaved their heads. And Sariputta decided he would go outside and meditate outside in the open air. And so he was sitting there deep in concentration at night, full moon shining down on his newly shaved head. And these 2 yakas flew over. So yakas are these large and kind of sometimes mischievous spirits, sometimes represented almost like giants. They fly, interesting creatures. And they're flying over and they see him sitting in the moonlight. And one yaka says to the other, look at that contemplative's head shining in the moonlight. That's so ridiculous. I think I'll go down and whack him on the noggin. And the other yaka said, no, you can't do that. This is an outstanding monk of great power. You have to be respectful to him. Well, they argued about this for a little while. And finally, the first yaka said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And so he swooped down and he hit Sariputta on the head. It is described in the discourse as with a blow that could have knocked over an elephant. I mean, these large, powerful, heavenly beings. But as soon as he touched Sariputta, the yaka burst into flames, and then he yelled, I'm burning, and he fell into hell. Mogallana was meditating inside the cave, but he saw this with his divine eye. And so he rushed out to check on Sariputta and see if he was okay. And Sariputta was still just sitting there meditating, and he says, and Mogallana asked him, says, are you in pain? Are you hurt? And Sariputta goes, no, I'm fine, but I do have a slight headache. And Mogallana was amazed that his concentration had been so developed that he could endure this great blow on the head with only a little pain. And Sariputta was also amazed that Mogallana could see what happened even from inside the cave. And he said, how great your power and might. Where you saw a yaka just now, I didn't even see a dust stone. So that's interesting. Sariputta was so powerful in his concentration that this massive blow from this heavenly being was hardly a breeze and just left him with a slight headache. And yet he's being kind to his friend and saying, "Oh, what great power do you have to be aware of this thing that happened." The Buddha compared Sariputta to a mother who gives birth. It said Mogallana was like a nursemaid who raises a child to adulthood. And the reason he said that was that both of them were very compassionate teachers, very good teachers, but in slightly different ways. Sariputta would stick with his students and instruct them just till they attained stream entry. And then he would kind of let them go, send them on their way, because he was confident once they got to that point, they'd make it the rest of the way on their own. But Mogallana would stay with his students as long as he could, and he saw many of them all the way through to becoming arahants. This nurturing personality of his is reflected, I think, in one of the most significant teachings associated with him. The Buddha and Mogallana were staying at the same monastery, and Mogallana's mother had recently passed away. And while he was meditating, he realized that she had been reborn and she was a hungry ghost. She was not a good person, and I'll tell that story later on for the podcast. But he made an offering of rice for her, but when she tried to eat it, it turned into burning coals, which is what happens to hungry ghosts. Hungry ghosts are like drug addicts or something. Something looks really good, but once you use it, then it becomes harmful to you and disgusting to you. And so he was so moved by compassion for his mother's suffering that he went to the Buddha in tears, wanting to know if he could help her. And it was based on this conversation that we now have the observation of Ulambana, or Oban in Japanese. And this is the Buddhist ancestor memorial. It's a big festival where people make offerings to ghosts and things like that. So neither Sariputta nor Mogallana outlived the Buddha. So I said that they were important to Buddhism even after the Buddha died. This is because they had their own followers, and they had helped spread Buddhism so that it was pretty well established beyond just the Buddha's existence. Mogallana died at the hands of ascetics who were jealous of the Buddha, and they thought if they could kill his chief disciple, that the Buddha's fame would be diminished. And so this cult hired assassins to kill him, Mogallana, and they surrounded the monastery when he was staying, but he used his supernatural power to escape through a keyhole. But he realized that he had to pay for some bad karma from a previous existence. So when the assassins came back, he allowed them to catch him, and they beat him mercilessly and left him for dead. But he entered meditation and pulled himself together so that he could go visit the Buddha to say goodbye. And he told the Buddha that he would soon realize parinirvana, complete unbinding. But the Buddha said, well, before you do, please assemble the monks and give a Dharma talk. And he did so, and then he left to go pass away. The news of his death spread very quickly, and the king of that region ordered an investigation. The assassins were found and executed, and the monks asked the Buddha, how could such a great being have died in this way? And the Buddha said, well, Mogallana lived a very noble life in this existence, and based on that, he shouldn't have met with such a death. But in a past existence, he had committed a terrible crime. And he said, he who does harm to those who are harmless will experience the consequences of his evil. Sariputta was meditating one day and realized that he wasn't going to live much longer. And so he decided that he would go visit his mother, who had not yet become a Buddhist. And he knew that she had the spiritual development to at least become a stream enterer. And so he called together a bunch of monks to accompany him, and he went to visit his mother. And so when he arrived at the village gate, he sent word ahead to her to prepare a room for him and to prepare lodging for the monks that were with him. And so when he arrived at his mother's house, she had a place for him. He was ill with dysentery. And so he's lying in bed, racked with illness. And while he was lying there dying, basically, gods started coming to visit him, including 4 divine kings. And Saka, who was the king of the gods, and the very highest god, Brahma, were coming to visit Sariputta. And his mother, because, as I said, she had enough spiritual development that she could see some things too. She saw what was happening with Sariputta and realized that her son was so important, that he was being visited by all these deities, and she understood that if her son was that virtuous, then the Buddha must really be something. And so she asked Sariputta, "Tell me about your teacher." And so his response was remembered, and to this day is chanted during services in Theravada temples. I won't chant the Pali this time. I'll save it for when I'm doing the podcast. But basically, he said, "The Buddha is blessed one, a worthy one, rightly self-awakened, consummate in knowledge and conduct, has gone the good way, knows the cosmos, trainer of those who can be trained, teacher of humans and divine beings, fully awakened and blessed." And so by the time he finished explaining all these virtues of the Buddha, his mother had realized stream entry. And so, having done that, he gathered his robes up around his face and lay down on one side and began to meditate. And shortly afterward, he passed away into nirvana. So that's kind of a basic introduction to Sariputta and Mogallana. I hope you've enjoyed that. And again, take these stories as spiritual stories. You don't have to believe in yakas and stuff like that, but they're these are descriptions of how you can live a spiritual life and transcend dukkha, transcend stress and difficulties for yourself. And they're just I'm sure that these stories have been mythologized quite a bit, but still very good examples of how someone can take the teachings all the way, and really how you can sort of be a superhero for others by putting teachings into practice and realizing that to the extent that you can. So I'm going to look now and see if I have any questions or comments to respond to. Oops. Okay, so Star has asked, how do you define an institution even when it fails individuals? I'm not sure what you're referring to. If you're referring to, I posted something on Facebook where I talked about well, I guess I'm not sure what you mean by define. An institution is a group of individuals who act together as a sort of as a unit with some system of governance and structure, and then a school is an institution. Because of the fact that an institution is made up of a lot of human beings, you can't say that an institution is a certain way based on the way a particular individual in that institution behaves. You can look at things like policies and procedures, and how an institution's culture, how its culture is reflected in the actions of the individuals kind of collectively. So, if a school has a policy against bullying, then, that's one element of it. But if it has a culture that condones or looks the other way when bullying happens, then, kind of what's its true character? I mean, institutions, I guess, have character just like people do. And a person can say, "Oh, I'm all for compassion. I believe in the power of compassion," and then leave the sanctity of the meditation hall and go out and be gossiping, right? So, which is the true character? Well, sometimes we as individuals, we have to practice something. So we take the precepts, for example, and we take the precepts against, against harmful speech. And on one level, that's our practice. On another level, we have this, we're habituated to harmful speech, to lying and gossiping or whatever it may be. And so, the practice then becomes to see, well, this is what I say I do, but yet here's what I actually do that's different than what I say. So let me try to align those two things. So if you look at that in an institutional setting, if a school, for example, has a policy to not allow bullying, but bullying happens, then it's kind of incumbent on somebody in the institution to be aware of that, and then to come up with a way to, enforce things and so on, so that the bullying stops. So, I'm not real sure why you're asking the question. So I don't know if I've answered it or not, since I'm not real sure why you're asking. But if you come Thursday, I think you're planning to come Thursday. We can talk about that a little bit more conversationally. Works a little bit better on Zoom to converse about something like that. So I don't see any other questions. You're welcome, Mary. All right, so I will do the dedication. Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now, and offering flowers, candles, and incense, hearing the Dharma and training the mind, great merit is attained. We dedicate this merit to the great Master Shakyamuni Buddha, the all-pervading and everlasting three treasures, to the 16 guardians and all protectors of the Dharma and their relations throughout space and time, to all ancestors of this Sangha and all beings in the Dharma world. May penetrating light dispel the darkness of ignorance. Let all karma be resolved and the mind flower bloom in eternal spring. May the Dharma body maintain strength and health, and years of life be lengthened for all teachers of this Sangha. May their vows be fully realized, and may they live in perfect peace with Buddha Dharma. We pray for those suffering from violence and those who grieve for them, for all those living in oppression, for all who are in prison who should be free, for all refugees from violence, hunger, and catastrophe, man-made or natural. We pray for the health and well-being of all those suffering from diseases of body, mind, or spirit, all those working toward the healing of those afflictions. We pray for all those suffering from COVID-19, those working to protect and treat them, and to those grieving for those lost to this pandemic. And at this time, we have members of our congregations, friends, and loved ones suffering from cancer and other diseases who are grieving for lost loved ones. We pray for them and send loving thoughts their way. I don't like to name people online just because it's out there forever. But, if you're one of the people who's been talking to me about some of the difficulties you're going through, understand that your suffering is noticed and you're in our thoughts. May they be serene through all their troubles, and may we realize the enlightened way together. Sabbe sata sadahantu avera sukha jivino katang punya phalang mahang sabbe bhagi bhavantu te. May all beings always live happily, free from animosity. May all share in the blessings that spring from the good we have done. So thank you again. I hope you have a great rest of the Sunday. It's a beautiful day outside if you're where I am, and hopefully it's a beautiful day wherever you are. And whether it's a nice day weather-wise or not, it's a good day. So enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.